The first thing you noticed about Harlan Voss was his shoes, not his face, not the three-piece suit that probably cost more than Daphne's rent for 4 months, not even the way he moved through the dining room of Cedrier like he owned it, which, in a sense, he believed he did. It was the shoes, oxblood calfskin, mirror-polished, without a single scuff. The kind of shoes a man wears when he wants everyone in the room to understand that he has never once had to stand on a factory floor, a construction site, or behind a service counter for 11 hours straight. Daphne Aubert had been standing behind service counters in one form or another since she was 19 years old. She was 31 now, and Cedrier was the best position she'd ever held. Not the best she'd deserved, but that was a distinction she'd made peace with a long time ago. The restaurant sat on the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, all white linen and low amber lighting, and a wine list that started at $200 a bottle. The tips were extraordinary. The clientele was not. She had learned, over the years, to read a table in the first 30 seconds. It was a survival skill, the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. Not pessimism, just pattern recognition. The way a man handed off his coat told you whether he'd tip 20% or 15%. The way a woman glanced around the room before sitting told you whether she'd send the food back once or twice. And the way Harlan Voss settled into table 7 that Tuesday evening with the slow, proprietary ease of someone claiming territory told Daphne everything she needed to know about the next 3 hours of her life. He was with 2 others, Théodore Blanchard, silver-haired and careful, who served as legal counsel to half the development companies in the GTA and who had dined at Cedrier often enough that Daphne knew he preferred his water still and his steak medium rare without being asked. And a younger man, late 20s, sharp-eyed, a little too eager in the way he arranged his napkin, whom she'd never seen before. Daphne would learn later that his name was Rowan Fitch, and that he'd been Voss's executive assistant for 8 months, which was longer than any of the previous 4 had lasted. Voss himself was the sort of man who'd built a commercial real estate empire in Ontario through a combination of genuine intelligence and an absolute refusal to treat anyone he considered beneath him as a full human being. He was 62. He had been profiled in 3 national magazines. He donated to hospital foundations in amounts large enough to get his name on waiting room plaques, and he used those plaques as conversational currency, dropping them into sentences the way other men might mention the weather. Daphne approached the table with the measured calm she'd spent years cultivating. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Cedrier." She set the menus with the particular precision the front-of-house manager required. A full inch from the table edge, no more, no less. "May I start you off with still or sparkling water this evening?" Blanchard looked up and smiled with genuine warmth. "Still for me, please. Daphne, isn't it?" "It is," she said. Rowan Fitch nodded, a little nervous. Harlan Voss did not look at her. He was studying the wine list the way generals study maps, and he said, in a tone calibrated precisely to indicate that the question was an interruption, "Sparkling." That was it. No please, no acknowledgement. The word dropped onto the table like a coin into a fountain, spent and forgotten immediately. She brought the water. She was halfway through describing the evening's amuse-bouche when Voss interrupted to ask Blanchard a question about a property assessment in Mississauga. Not rudely, exactly, more in the manner of a man who genuinely could not conceive that the words coming from her direction required any particular attention. She paused, finished when there was a gap, took their orders, left. In the kitchen, one of the junior servers, a young woman named Petra, who was working her first month at Cedrier, and still flinched at certain tones of voice, caught Daphne's expression as she clipped the order to the board. "Table 7, Petra asked. Table 7, Daphne confirmed, and said nothing more. It started, as it often did with men like Voss, with the small humiliations. The wine she'd recommended was dismissed without tasting, because Voss had already decided he wanted something from a specific producer in Burgundy, and when she explained gently that they'd sold the last of that vintage 2 weeks prior, he looked at her for the first time with an expression of mild contempt. The kind that wasn't anger, exactly, just a fundamental disappointment that the world around him kept failing to arrange itself correctly. The bread was wrong, not the bread itself. Chef Arsenault's sourdough was extraordinary, and everyone in the room knew it, but the temperature, apparently. Voss touched a slice, set it down, and said to Blanchard, not to Daphne, "You'd think for what they charge here." She refilled the water. She smiled. She did not let anything show. What Harlan Voss did not know, what he had no reason to consider, because he had not once wondered about the person refilling his water, was that Daphne Aubert had spent 2.5 years in a graduate program in biochemistry at the University of Toronto before her mother's diagnosis changed everything. Multiple sclerosis, progressive variant, the kind that doesn't plateau. Her mother, Sylviane, had worked 30 years as a hospital administrator, had raised Daphne and her younger brother on a single income after their father left, and had done it with a particular fierce dignity that Daphne had absorbed so completely she sometimes couldn't tell where her mother ended, and she began. When Sylviane could no longer work, when the benefit coverage gaps became impossible, and the pharmaceutical costs became surreal, Daphne had made a decision. She'd deferred, then quietly withdrawn, told herself it was temporary, and taken every high-paying service job she could find. The graduate program had been in Montreal. The restaurants that could pay her well enough to manage her mother's care were in Toronto. The math was simple, and it was brutal, and she had made it work for 6 years now without complaint, because complaining about it would not make her mother's legs move any better. She was good at this work. She was precise and warm, and she could read a room the way she used to read a spectroscopy analysis, quickly, accurately, without sentimentality. Chef Arsenault had told her once that she was the best front-of-house person he'd worked with in 20 years, which was high praise from a man who considered most compliments a waste of breath. None of this was visible to Harlan Voss. To Harlan Voss, she was the woman who brought the bread at the wrong temperature. The shift happened about 40 minutes into the meal. Voss had been on his second glass of wine, not the Burgundy he'd wanted, but a Côte du Rhône she'd selected, and which he had accepted with the air of a man making a significant concession, and the conversation at table 7 had moved into territory that Daphne recognized as business. Not polite business, the kind that lowers its voice. She was at the table refilling water, functionally invisible the way good servers learn to be when she heard it. Voss switched languages, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He simply slid from English into Québécois French, the particular dense, idiomatic French of working-class Montreal, the kind that is almost a dialect unto itself, full of archaisms and compressed vowels and expressions that don't translate cleanly, even for people whose French is otherwise fluent. It was, Daphne understood immediately, a very deliberate choice. Blanchard, whose French was the careful Parisian-influenced variety of a man who'd studied it in school, followed along with visible effort. Rowan Fitch, clearly Anglophone, clearly lost, simply looked at his plate, and Voss spoke freely. What he said, in that dense Québécois cadence, that he clearly believed the woman pouring his water could not pass, was this: that the Beaumont Street rezoning application that Blanchard had been shepherding through the City Planning Committee had required certain assurances, that those assurances had been provided, in the form of a contribution to a particular fund routed through a numbered company, and that the city councillor in question, he used a nickname, a very specific one, the kind people only know if they actually know the person, had confirmed receipt, that the variance they needed would clear the committee by Thursday, that it needed to clear before the Friday announcement, because the announcement would change the land value, and anyone looking at it afterward would be able to work backward to the contribution and see the timeline for what it was. Blanchard's expression throughout this did not change. The particular skill of a man who has been a lawyer for 35 years is the capacity to hear things without visibly receiving them. Rowan Fitch looked like he wished he were somewhere else. Daphne set down the water pitcher. She said, in English, "Will you gentlemen need anything else before your mains arrive?" Voss glanced at her with that mild impatience and said, "We're fine." She walked back toward the kitchen. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. She had understood every word. Her mother was from Rosemont. Her grandmother's kitchen had smelled like tourtière and pine cleaner and the specific must of old Quebec paperbacks stacked by the radiator, and Daphne had grown up code switching between the careful institutional French of school and the fast, compressed, beautifully messy French of family gatherings where everyone talked at once and the jokes only landed if you understood exactly what was being compressed. She had written her undergraduate thesis in French. She had done 2 semesters of coursework in Montreal. She had, for the first 22 years of her life, spent every Christmas in a kitchen where the French that was spoken was exactly the French that Harlan Voss had just used to discuss what sounded, to her clearly, like the mechanics of a bribe. She stood in the service corridor for a moment and looked at the wall. She was not naive about what happened in rooms like this. She had worked in enough rooms like this to understand that the distance between the dining room and the city planning committee was not as wide as the menus suggested. She was also not a fool about what she was holding. She had no recording. She had the memory of a specific conversation, partially overheard, in a language the speaker had chosen because he believed she couldn't understand it. That was not nothing, but it was also not enough, on its own, to do anything with. What she needed to think about was Thursday, and the Friday announcement, and the numbered company. Petra appeared at her elbow. "Mains are up for 7. "I've got it," Daphne said. She carried the plates to the table with the same precise care she brought to everything. She set Blanchard's steak in front of him, medium rare, as always. She set Rowan Fitch's sea bass in front of him, and he thanked her with a sincerity that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the evening. She set Voss's lamb in front of him without comment. Voss cut into the lamb and said, in English, to Blanchard, "The problem with that Westmount project is that it's LeBlanc's territory, and LeBlanc doesn't move." Back to English, the language of the table, now that the other business was finished. Daphne moved away. She spent the next hour doing her job exactly as she always did, with the particular disciplined attention that comes not from enthusiasm but from genuine professionalism, which is a different thing entirely. She refilled. She checked. She described the dessert menu to a couple at table 3 with the same warmth she brought to every table every evening, regardless of what else was occupying the specific, very crowded room of her mind. What was occupying her mind was the name he'd used, the nickname. She knew it because her mother had voted in that ward for 23 years and had opinions about every local politician with the particular invested passion of someone who had seen what bad planning decisions did to a neighborhood over decades. The nickname was not publicly known. It was the kind of thing that only circulates among people who are actually in that world. That was the detail that mattered, That was the detail that turned an overheard conversation into something with coordinates. By the time Table 7 was finishing their desserts, Voss had ordered the cheese plate and was not, from the look of things, finding it inadequate, which Daphne took as a minor moral victory on behalf of the cheese. She had decided what she was going to do. Not in the way that decisions in movies are made, with a swelling moment of resolve and a change in the quality of light. Just quietly, the way she had decided to leave Montreal and to take her mother home from the hospital the third time, and to defer the graduate program, and to make all the other decisions that had brought her to this particular Tuesday evening on the 14th floor, with the same clear-eyed assessment of what was real and what was possible and what had to be done. She went to the small office near the wine storage, where the manager kept a notepad by the phone, and she wrote down exactly what she had heard, in French, verbatim, with the time and the date and the table number. She noted the specific nickname. She noted the mention of Thursday and Friday and the numbered company. She noted that Théodore Blanchard had been present. She noted that Rowan Fitch had been present. She noted that the language switch had been deliberate, that Voss had initiated it, that no one had announced it, that it had occurred specifically when the content of the conversation changed. She put the notepad in her apron pocket. When the bill came, Voss paid it with a black card without looking at the total. He added a tip that was adequate, in the particular way that some wealthy people calculate adequacy. Enough that no one could complain, not enough to suggest any recognition of a person. He said to Blanchard, pulling on his jacket, "Thursday, then," and Blanchard nodded once, economically. Rowan Fitch lingered for a moment after the other two had moved toward the door. He looked at Daphne with an expression that she couldn't quite read. Part discomfort, part something that might have been warning, part the expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours watching a situation unfold that they were not sure they should be part of. He said quietly, "Thank you for the service." "Of course," she said. "Have a good evening." He hesitated. Then he followed the others out. She watched them go. The rest of the shift passed the way shifts pass with the small constant logistics of a busy restaurant winding down, the side work and the roll-ups and the end-of-night check-ins with the kitchen. Petra was wrapping cutlery and looking tired in the way of someone genuinely new to these hours. Daphne helped her without being asked, which she did whenever she had the energy for it, because she remembered being Petra, and someone had helped her then too. It was past midnight when she got home. Her mother was awake, which was not unusual. The medication schedule meant odd hours, and Sylviane had in any case always been a night person, a trait Daphne had inherited along with her cheekbones and her particular brand of composed stubbornness. She was in the living room with the television on low, a book open in her lap, and she looked up when Daphne came in with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read the quality of another person's silence. "Long night," Sylviane said. "Long night," Daphne agreed. She sat down on the end of the couch and pulled off her shoes and looked at the television without seeing it. "You have something on your mind. I always have something on my mind. This is a different something." Daphne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maman, if you heard someone say something they absolutely did not want you to understand, because they were certain you couldn't, what would you do?" Sylviane considered this with the thoroughness she brought to everything. "I would first be sure I'd understood correctly. Then I would decide what my responsibility was. Then I would act on it. In that order, always in that order." Daphne nodded. She already knew she'd understood correctly. She'd spent the drive home replaying it, and she had not misheard a syllable. Her mother's French was the same French. She was certain. She spent 2 days being certain. She looked up the Beaumont Street file on the city's public planning portal. She found the rezoning application, commercial mixed use, submitted 8 months prior, currently under committee review. She found the committee roster. She found, with some research, the name behind the nickname Voss had used, which was not difficult once you knew which ward and which committee and which particular Tuesday night habit of political life you were looking for. She did not call a journalist because she wasn't sure she was ready for what that started. She called a lawyer. Not Blanchard, someone she'd met through her mother's healthcare appeals process, a woman named Adaisy, who worked in civil law and had a clear-eyed pragmatism that Daphne respected enormously. She described what she'd heard without naming names, and Adaisy listened without interrupting, and at the end she said, "What you have is your own testimony." That's a starting point, not an end point. The question is what exists to corroborate it. The numbered company, Daphne said. Yes, Adaisy said, if it exists in a searchable registry, and if the timing of its incorporation or its transactions aligns with what you heard. That's corroboration. That's the thing that makes your testimony worth something to someone with subpoena power. How do I find that? Corporate registry is public. You know what name to look for? I know enough, Daphne said. She did not find the exact company, but she found 2 registered in the relevant time frame with naming patterns that aligned with what she'd heard. The kind of generic, forgettable corporate names that are chosen precisely because they don't suggest anything. One of them had a registered address that, when she looked it up, was a commercial mail forwarding service on King Street. She went back to Adaisy. She also, in those 2 days, thought often about Thursday and the Friday announcement, about what it meant that the land value would change after the announcement and that the timeline would become legible to anyone looking backward from it. Thursday came. The committee met. The variance cleared as Voss had predicted it would. Friday morning, the announcement landed in the business section of 3 papers simultaneously. A major mixed-use development, approved for the Beaumont Street corridor, anchored by Voss Property Group, projected to transform the neighborhood over the next decade. The land value in the surrounding blocks moved immediately and substantially. Daphne was drinking coffee at her kitchen table when she read it. She thought about her mother at 23, working a hospital admissions desk and voting in ward elections because she believed, genuinely and without irony, that it mattered who made decisions about the city. She thought about Rosemont and what it had looked like before certain planning decisions had changed it, and what it had looked like after. She thought about the kitchen that smelled like tourtière, and the grandmother who had spoken in the fast compressed French of a woman who'd never gone to university, but who had been nobody's fool in any language. She wrote a letter, not to a journalist, not yet, to the city's integrity commissioner, whose office existed precisely for this. She wrote it in the careful, precise prose of someone trained in technical documentation, and she attached her written notes from that evening, and she included the corporate registry findings, and she described clearly and specifically the mechanism by which she believed the information was reliable, that the speaker had chosen to use a specific regional dialect under the explicit assumption that it would not be understood by anyone within earshot. She was, she wrote, a native speaker of the same dialect. She had understood every word. She signed it with her full name. She sent it. The weeks after that were ordinary in the way that weeks are ordinary when you have done something that has no immediate visible effect. You go to work, you do your job, you come home, you refill your mother's medications and watch television too late and wonder if anything you did will matter. Petra got better at the roll-ups. Chef Arsenault introduced a new spring menu. Blanchard came back for dinner once and was, as always, gracious with her, and she was, as always, professional, and neither of them said anything about the evening she was thinking about. Voss did not come back. 3 months later, an investigative piece ran in one of the papers. It was careful and well-sourced, and it did not mention Daphne by name. She had asked, when the journalist had called her after receiving some of what she'd filed, that her role be described only as a witness. And the journalist had honored that. The piece described the timeline of the Beaumont Street approval, the numbered company, the contribution, the counselor. It used the nickname, in context with explanation, and noted that the nickname was known to a limited circle, which was itself a form of evidence. Harlan Voss, the piece reported, had declined to comment. Theodore Blanchard had resigned from the file. Rowan Fitch had, quietly, left the position. Daphne read the piece on her phone in the service corridor at Cedrier, between the lunch shift and the dinner shift, while the kitchen clattered and the prep cooks called to each other, in the mix of French and English and Tagalog and Somali. That was the actual sound of the city behind the white linen rooms, where people like Harlan Voss conducted their business in languages they believed no one around them could understand. She put her phone in her apron pocket. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen. The speed of that French, the warmth of it, the compression. The way her grandmother could say something in 10 words that would take an English sentence 30, and somehow the 10 words landed harder. A whole inheritance wrapped in a dialect that a man in oxblood shoes had treated as a guarantee of privacy. She thought that her grandmother would have found this extremely funny. Then the kitchen pass-through opened, and the first tickets of the evening service began to print, and Daphne Aubert tied her apron, squared her shoulders, and went to do her job.